So on a bit of a different note, I recently read a New York Times article about composer Julia Wolf. She's native to Pennsylvania, and she wrote an award-winning choral piece about coal mining in her native state of Pennsylvania called Anthracite Fields. And this piece in particular honors the sacrifices of Pennsylvania coal miners with overtones of work, exploitation, and unionization of that particular area. So she did this by incorporating real names from the index of those who worked, struggled, and even died during their times of working as coal miners. And her work was very well and widely received in that area. It also proved to be a very meaningful thing for her audiences. This was also in the recent times of bringing back the coal industry when that rhetoric kind of started appearing again. So how do you see the commissioning of new works or the composing of new works as a tool to help communities record their stories, such as what Julia Wolf did for her community?
Well, I have to say I'm not familiar with Julia Wolf or that piece, but that sounds very compelling. I think art can be political. It has been traditionally for certain time periods and certain composers. I mean, just going back to Shostakovich, who I mentioned earlier, you know, there's an example of music that really always has political overtones or undertones. Sometimes it can be more overt, and in the case of this piece, it sounds completely frank about what it's trying to express. And I think that can be a very powerful way of changing the world. Art does have a lot of communicative power. So sometimes an artistic message that relates to world events can hold more resonance for people than protests on the street. You know, it can encapsulate anger and elevate it. Because that's, I think, what art does. Actually, it was Marlon Brando. I heard he was talking about classical music in an interview because, you know, many people consider him like the greatest American actor. And he was poo-pooing all of that and saying, no, I'm not an artist. This is not art. This is craft. Acting is nothing, and anyone can do it. And he was going on and on about it. And he was saying, you know, if you want to look at art, look at a Mozart string quartet, which was like, you know, very surprising to the interviewer. And he was saying that great art elevates. And so I think that's actually quite wise, because I think that's the difference between pop art and fine art. I mean, the words fine and pop, they're really limited. I think they're not great words, but they're just the words we use, so we know what we're talking about. But fine art, I think its purpose is to take emotion and intellectual concepts and elevate them into a message that goes to the highest in other people. So, you know, I always love to imagine that during a political tragedy or hard times, if we could just get the right people to sit down at a table with no weapons and no ability to leave the room and no ability to hang up a phone, and just look each other in the eye and just talk it through all the way until it's done, that you could resolve probably any conflict. Unfortunately, it never happens because there's always an escape for fear, you know, and hatred and things like that. And so I think that scenario I'm describing would be sort of people extracting the highest version of what their qualms are about whatever the subject is, delivering them, and then receiving back the highest kernel of the other person's point of view, and then finding a way to resolve conflict. And I think that that's what art does. It takes the highest elements and it produces this message that's, you know, a facsimile of the best part of you versus the lowest part of you. And not to disparage pop, there's many forms of pop art and folk art that I really appreciate, but I think pop art is more raw. It's more about just the middle ground of what you feel. So I think of, you know, songs about, you know, like pop songs about sex or about, it's like, it's not designed to elevate it, it's just designed to describe it as it is on an everyday basis. But sometimes political messages that are described on an everyday basis are too raw. There's been such tragedy and horrible things that have occurred that you need to elevate the conversation to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And so a work of art can do that.
That's beautiful. Um, this is also just another side note of my train of thought, but I've also thought a lot about music that builds people up, even without explicitly saying so. And for me, that composer would be Bach.
Mm.
And whenever I listen to his music, you know, especially in times that are difficult, or
Mhm.
I see things going on in the world that can be discouraging, I love to just sit in a quiet place and listen to Bach, because it's music that somehow builds my soul.
Yeah.
Is there a composer for you,
Mhm.
or a particular piece, or?
There are many. Bach is one of them. And that comes from my mother. My mother reveres Bach above all others. And when she would be upset or depressed or angry, she would go to the other room and always put on like St. Matthew Passion or B minor Mass or something. And I know exactly what you're saying. You know, if I'm hearing an aria like Erbarme dich, mein Gott, or something, where he's pleading to God, and I'm not Christian, I'm a Jew, but Bach has elevated the human frailty to the highest level and delivered a message of beauty and despair and then hope in the highest form. And so no matter what your background is, if you're open to that, you can receive the message. It's transmitted directly from him. And I think it's very much like how people find solace in religion, because if you're reading the great book, whatever it is, for your particular religion, and you read the parables or you read the lessons to be learned, you're reading stories that are designed to represent the highest version of that story. And on some level, the story you're experiencing is some variation on that story that you're reading. And so there can be a connection to that version of the story that's highest, that can elevate your own plight and make you feel comforted. And also just knowing that someone great has really thought it through, you know, and experienced it. So I'm with you on that. And it's Bach, I mean, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, Chopin. I mean, there's so many composers that do it for me.
Yeah.